For 17 years after his wedding, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha held no official title in the country where he lived and worked. Parliament refused him a British peerage. It refused Queen Victoria's private wish to see her husband named King Consort. In the eyes of the law, the man who shared Victoria's bed helped raise her 9 children, and increasingly made the decisions of her government was simply His Royal Highness Prince Albert, a foreign prince from a small German duchy barely the size of an English county. Only in 1857, 17 years into the marriage, did Victoria grant him the title Prince Consort by her own authority, because Parliament still would not settle the question by law. And yet, inside Buckingham Palace, once the day's public engagements had ended and the doors of the private apartments closed for the evening, it was very often Albert, not any minister of the crown, who remained at his desk, working through the papers that would shape the direction of the country. The public record of his life is mostly a daytime record: ceremonies, inspections, speeches. What did the evening, the part the Constitution never formally acknowledged, actually look like? Buckingham Palace in these years was still in the process of becoming the building it is today. John Nash had transformed it for Victoria's uncle, King George IV, in the 1820s. But by February 1845, Victoria was complaining to her Prime Minister, Robert Peel, that there was not enough room in it for her growing family, or for the entertaining expected of a monarch. The architect Edward Bloor was brought in to enclose the palace's open forecourt with a new east wing, paid for partly by the sale of the Brighton Pavilion, and it was Albert who suggested adding a central balcony to the new facade, the same balcony the royal family still appears on today. Victoria and Albert kept their own private rooms in the north wing, a working household inside the larger household, separate from the ceremonial staterooms used for public occasions. Buckingham Palace served the couple mainly as their working London residence, used most heavily during the parliamentary session and the social season, while Windsor, Osborne, and Balmoral absorbed more of their purely family time. On an evening during the season, the palace contained 2 distinct kinds of activity at once: a private family adjusting to a still unfinished building, and the working headquarters of the British monarchy. The working day did not end when official visitors left. Early in the marriage, as Victoria's first pregnancies kept her from her own desk for long stretches, she and Albert had pushed their writing tables together in her sitting room so that he could read and answer state papers at her side. What began as a practical arrangement never really changed. By 1845, the diarist Charles Greville was already noting how completely Albert had taken on business that Victoria herself had little taste for, and the 2 desks stayed together for the rest of the marriage, piled most evenings with the boxes that carried government papers into the palace. Albert was personally responsible for formalizing the system, still used today, by which state papers traveled to and from the sovereign in a locked box covered in red leather. Accounts from the period suggest he favored red because it was a color used in the arms of his own family, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Whatever the reason, by evening those boxes were often still open on the desk, their contents read, annotated, and sorted by a man Parliament had never given a vote, a seat in the House of Lords, or any defined constitutional role at all. Before turning fully to that evening's papers, Albert generally made time to see his children. The palace nurseries had been built at some distance from the family's own rooms, down a stretch of corridor long enough that small children found it tiring to walk. Rather than leave the youngest to be carried by a nurse alone, Albert sometimes carried them himself in a basket along the passage between the nursery wing and the private apartments, a habit still remembered by people who worked in the household years afterward. The children's daily program was strict and detailed, drawn up with the help of Albert's older mentor, Baron Stockmar, and overseen day to day by Lady Littleton, who had charge of the nursery. Albert personally reviewed lessons, required written reports from governesses and tutors, and chose the men who would eventually teach his sons. None of the 9 children attended a public school. The family held to the belief that a prince or princess needed a controlled private education rather than exposure to children of uncertain background. For all this discipline, those who saw Albert with his children in the evening described a different man from the reserved figure at official functions, someone especially indulgent toward his youngest daughter, Beatrice, and briefly more relaxed than at almost any other point in his day. Once the children had been handed back to their nurses for the night, Albert withdrew to dress for dinner. From the late 1840s, this task belonged to his valet, Rudolf Lulling, a fellow German who entered the prince's service and stayed with him for the rest of his life. Lulling's duties went well beyond dressing alone, laying out clothes suited to each part of the day, maintaining a wardrobe that had to serve a man, moving between farm inspections and state banquets within the same week, and traveling with the family whenever they moved between residences. The change of clothes each evening marked a real change of role. During the day, Albert might have worn a plain coat suited to inspecting troops or walking the grounds of a model farm. By evening, especially if guests were expected, he generally put on one of the formal uniforms and orders attached to his position, including the star and sash of the Order of the Garter, to which Victoria had appointed him in the year of their wedding. People who saw him at this hour occasionally remarked on how tired he looked once the public manner was briefly set aside between rooms. By the 1850s, years of rising before 5 each morning and working steadily into the night had begun to show in frequent colds, chills, and stomach complaints that never fully cleared. What followed depended entirely on what kind of evening it was. On an ordinary night, dinner at Buckingham Palace was a family meal, taken with Victoria and, as they grew older, some of the elder children, in one of the smaller dining rooms, rather than the grand staterooms kept for public occasions. Even then, protocol was not set aside. Courses were served in a fixed order, staff attended according to strict rank, and conversation at table stayed within limits. Victoria herself enforced without hesitation. As at most large dinners of the period, the ladies eventually withdrew before the gentlemen, who traditionally remained at the table a while longer. On nights when foreign royalty, ministers, or ambassadors were entertained, the evening became something else entirely. Guests arrived by carriage under armed escort, a precaution the household had taken seriously since a string of attempts on Victoria's life in the 1840s, and were received in staterooms decorated decades earlier for George IV before being seated according to a precedence worked out well in advance. After 1855, when the architect James Pennethorne completed a new ball and concert room for the palace, the grandest of these dinners and the concerts that followed them increasingly moved there. It remains the largest room in Buckingham Palace, and its construction had been motivated largely by Victoria's own wish for more space to entertain and to hear music performed properly. Before it existed, state balls in the 1840s had been held instead in the throne room, lit for the occasion by several hundred candles that made the room, by every account, uncomfortably warm. Not every evening was spent within the palace walls. When the couple wished to hear an opera or see a play beyond what could be arranged privately at home, they went out into London itself, occupying a royal box at one of the city's opera houses rather than mixing with the general audience. These outings required their own preparation. Carriages, mounted escorts, and staff sent ahead to confirm arrangements, all coordinated by the same household offices that ran an ordinary evening inside the palace. The couple's return afterward, often well after midnight, brought them back through streets still only partly lit, to a palace where at least one attendant stayed awake specifically to receive them. Music, for Albert, was never simply another palace entertainment. He had trained as an organist, singer, and composer in Germany, and Buckingham Palace held a room built specifically to house his organ, where he could play alone or for a small audience of family and friends. He once described the organ as the instrument best suited to expressing real feeling, in clear contrast to the careful, formal language expected of him for most of the rest of his day. The composer Felix Mendelssohn visited the palace 5 times between 1842 and 1847 and was repeatedly asked by the royal couple to play. On at least one visit, Victoria herself worked the organ's bellows so that Albert could demonstrate his own playing to their guest, an arrangement Mendelssohn later described with real admiration in a letter home. Piano duets were, if anything, an even more constant part of the couple's evenings. Victoria had played the piano nearly every day since her teenage years, and the arrangements of Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart that she recorded playing with her husband throughout their marriage were a meeting of equals rather than a lesson from one to the other. Alongside music, Albert composed himself, including a set of duets whose closing bars he later reworked into an arrangement of the national anthem. Albert also rebuilt the palace's small private wind band into a full orchestra and, over the following 2 decades, arranged private concerts at Buckingham Palace and Windsor that included some of the first performances in England of major works by Schubert, Mendelssohn, and Wagner. When the music ended, the evening's paperwork was rarely finished. Both Victoria and Albert wrote an extraordinary number of letters, and Albert in particular kept up a large private correspondence with relations still in Germany and Belgium. His elder brother Ernest, who had inherited their father's duchy, and his uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, who had guided much of Albert's own education before the marriage. Much of this was written in German rather than English, alongside the growing volume of English state business that passed across his desk. He filed and cross-referenced his papers with the same discipline he applied to government business, aware that a careless sentence sent even to a trusted relative could become a diplomatic embarrassment if it reached the wrong hands. It was Albert, usually working after the more sociable part of the evening had ended, who drafted many of the memoranda that shaped Victoria's dealings with her ministers, softening language he judged too blunt for a constitutional monarch to use, and keeping careful written records of conversations the Queen herself might not otherwise have thought to preserve. For much of the marriage's early and middle years, Baron Stockmar himself was often present for evening sessions of this kind. A German physician originally sent to England by Leopold of the Belgians to judge whether his nephew Albert was fit to marry the young queen, Stockmar stayed on afterward as an unofficial counselor to them both, holding no post recognized by English law and drawing no salary from the crown. Biographers describe him working alongside Albert late into the evening on political memoranda, including advice on how to manage a Foreign Secretary Victoria and Albert both judged too independent of the crown, and on the broader project of teaching Victoria to treat the monarchy as a position above party politics rather than an extension of her own preferences. Like Albert, Stockmar held no office any English court would have recognized. His influence over some of the most consequential decisions of Victoria's reign was, by design, never written into any record a future historian could easily point to. Some evenings, ordinary family life and correspondence were replaced entirely by matters of state. During the Crimean War, which began in 1854, Albert worked out for himself a strategy for the conflict, arguing that British and French forces should lay siege to Sevastopol while pressuring Russia economically rather than seeking a further string of costly battles, a plan the Allies broadly followed once an early victory failed to appear. His reward for this level of engagement was, for a time, deep public suspicion. Because he was German, and because Prussia was reluctant to join Britain and France against Russia, rumors spread that Albert himself secretly favored the Russian side. At the worst of it, crowds reportedly gathered outside the Tower of London in the belief that the prince was about to be brought there as a prisoner on charges of treason. Albert dismissed the accusations in private as worthless, but the episode was a plain reminder of how little real protection his position offered him. A man with no vote, no seat in Parliament, and for most of his marriage no title beyond the one the Queen had given him personally, could still be accused in public of betraying the very government he was, in practice, helping to run each night. That same winter, when the war correspondent William Howard Russell's newspaper reports on the Army's mismanagement in the Crimea began reaching London, Albert read them at his desk with real irritation, complaining in one exchange that the pen and ink of one miserable scribbler was despoiling the country. An odd complaint from a man who had himself spent evenings quietly planning the war Russell was reporting on. Not every extra hour Albert gave to his desk in the evening was demanded of him by others. Some of it he created for himself. As president of the Society of Arts from 1843, and later as the working head of the Royal Commission that organized the Great Exhibition of 1851, he spent months of evenings reviewing designs, correspondence, and building plans for a project many in government regarded as, at best, a distraction. Its enormous success that year, held at the purpose-built Crystal Palace, did more than almost anything else to change British opinion of him. He applied the same close attention to detail to his reorganization of the palace's own domestic administration, strengthening the office of master of the household, so that one person, rather than several competing departments, answered for the smooth running of both ordinary days and the grandest state occasions. The structure he put in place in the 1840s still forms the basic administrative shape of the royal household today. Reading occupied much of whatever time was left. Albert worked through a stack of newspapers most evenings, British and European, partly to gauge public opinion on a government in which he had no formal role, and partly to follow developments on the continent that concerned his wider family. He also kept himself informed on subjects well beyond the ordinary range of royal duty: agricultural improvement, sanitary reform, and the industrial technology he had done so much to showcase at the Great Exhibition. He experimented with new farming methods and machinery on the royal estates, corresponded with scientists and engineers, and pressed, not always successfully, for better drainage and ventilation in the design of new housing for the poor. None of this fell within any recognized duty of a royal consort. Britain's constitution had no place for a prince who read reports on drainage and sewage after dinner, any more than it had a place for one who devised military strategy or drafted memoranda for the Foreign Office. Albert did it anyway. The absence of a defined constitutional role left him, in practice, with an unusually wide range of subjects he was free to decide for himself, deserved his evening hours. Those who worked closely with Albert in his final years described a man who drove himself with little regard for his own health. He rose before 5 most mornings and rarely stopped working until well into the night, a routine he described to his eldest daughter in terms that made clear how little relief he felt from it year after year. Biographers have since called him an aloof, dutiful workaholic with few close friends outside his own family, a description that fits a man who appeared to treat even his hours of rest as one more set of duties to be performed correctly. By the later 1850s, the effects were visible: recurring stomach pain, colds that lingered longer than they should, and a general exhaustion Victoria herself noted with growing concern in her own diary. He continued regardless, partly because he genuinely believed no one else would handle the work as carefully as he did, and partly because the Constitution he served had never given him a formal way to delegate any of it. Long after Albert and Victoria had gone to their own rooms, much of the palace household remained at work. Household instructions drawn up for the Lord Chamberlain in the 1840s describe housemaids assigned specifically to the private apartments, responsible through the evening for keeping fires lit and candles replaced as they burned down, and for preparing the rooms before the family retired. The palace's grandest spaces might be lit for a few hours by several hundred candles during a state occasion, but on an ordinary evening the private rooms depended on the same candlelight and coal fires used in any large house of the period, tended by servants whose own working day would not end until the families did, and would begin again the following morning long before either Albert or Victoria woke. At Buckingham Palace, as in the family's other residences, Victoria and Albert shared a bedroom, an arrangement that was not automatic among royal couples of the period, but one the two of them kept for the whole of their marriage, until Albert's final illness. Lurline or another attendant would have prepared the room in advance, banking the fire for the night and clearing the papers Albert had been working through from view until morning. It was in this room that the day, which had started with him at his desk before dawn, finally came to an end. A man who spent his evenings drafting the language of a government still going to bed in the end, as an ordinary husband and father. Albert died in December 1861 at the age of 42, after a short illness that followed weeks of exhaustion and a walk taken in poor weather with his eldest son Bertie, whom he had traveled to Cambridge to confront over a personal matter Albert feared would damage the family's reputation. He caught a chill on that visit that never really cleared and was diagnosed with typhoid fever less than a month later. For years afterward, Victoria kept his rooms and belongings at Buckingham Palace and Windsor exactly as he had left them. The title Parliament had refused him for 17 years, and the one Victoria eventually gave him herself never described what he actually did each night behind those doors. The shared desks, the red boxes, the organ room, the letters written late into the night. None of it appeared in any law defining his position. It was simply how, evening after evening, the work of governing a country was quietly performed in part by a man that country's own constitution had never formally agreed to recognize.